Welcome back to Unit 1, Fairy Tales and Tall Tales. Today we are moving into Lesson 5 and we are moving away from fairy tales into our new genre of fiction, Tall Tales. In our first story, we're going to be talking about a guy named Paul Bunyan. Before we do that, let's go over our vocab words that we have learned throughout this unit so far. Again, I'm going to say the word. You're going to repeat it after I say it. Here we go. First word, displeases. Curious. Fortune. Tune. Constant. Let's go through them one more time. Again, I'll read it. You repeat it. Displeases. Curious, fortune, tune, constant. Anyone remember what word in this list has a prefix? Which word has a prefix? Well, second question on our vocab list, which of these words has a multiple meaning or more than one meaning? Remember, that one was the word tune. It meant a song or to a small fix. It has a couple meanings to it. So today we're moving away from fairy tales and we're going to learn about a different type of fiction story called tall tales. Now, tall tales are humorous or funny stories and are sometimes about real-life heroes of the American frontier during the 1800s. So that's the year, that was almost 200 years ago. So some of these stories were about real people, but we'll talk about how it's a fiction story. Before we do that, I have two maps here, and this would be the map of America way back in the time these stories took place. Now, you see these states in the pink? Those were the states that were there back in those times. It wasn't 50. That's definitely not 50 states. And Michigan isn't even a state at this point. Then this map is about 50 years later, and you can see, look at how the United States is getting bigger. But the American frontier is when the United States, you see how all these states are on the right side of the map, or that's called the east side of the map. Then look at, there's more states now, and this is on the west side. So what people did was they came in through the ocean. They said, oh, it's getting crowded here. So they started moving out west. So that's why it's called the American frontier, because they're starting to move out west for more farmland and more they had a lot more space to work with. So that's where all of our stories are going to be taking place, are people moving out west into the new frontier. Before we move into our first tall tale of Paul Bunyan, I have a quick little video I want to play you that kind of gives you a background on what makes a tall tale, or what are different, remember that word, characteristics that make up a tall tale.
Jeannie, come quick. What? What is it? It's Paul Bunyan. The Paul Bunyan. He's down by the town square. What? He's as big as they say. A lumberjack as tall as a mountain, eating flapjacks off a giant frying pan. And of course, there's Babe, the biggest, bluest ox you've ever seen. No! I know who Paul Bunyan is, but I thought he was just a tall tale. Oh, what? A tall tale. A tall tale is a kind of folk tale. They're stories from the American frontier. That's where we are. Yeah, but they also have amazing, larger-than-life characters, and they're told using exaggerations. What? Exaggerations. It's when you overstate or stretch the truth. Like how I'm the biggest, harvest, cattle roping, lasso throwing, fire stoking cowgirl this side of the Rio Grande. Hey, quit it. An exaggeration is what you say if you want something to seem bigger or taller or amazinger than it actually is. Well, he's not a tall tale or exaggeration or whatever. I'm telling you, Paul Bunyan is actually here. I've seen him with my own eyes. He's as tall as a mountain. I saw him and his big blue ox eating flapjacks as big as a field. Well, this I've gotta see to believe. There! Didn't I tell you? Whoa! Amazing! Isn't he something? I can't wait to tell everybody.
So that video just gives us a little bit of a background on what tall tales are. Again, tall tales are about these people in that American frontier time. And a lot of the times they tell this story and they have lots of exaggeration. You can see this word right here. It's in the bold. It's exaggeration. I'm going to say that word and I want you to repeat it. Exaggeration. Now, tall tales have lots of exaggeration. Remember, that means it's when you stretch the truth. An example of exaggeration could be, it is so hot outside that the sidewalk is melting. So it probably was pretty hot outside, but the sidewalk isn't really melting. But it's stretching the truth. It's showing that it's pretty hot out. Today, during your read aloud, you should be able to, after it, identify examples of exaggeration from this tall tale. So we're going to be reading through, and at the end, I want you to figure out what were some things that were being exaggerated in this tall tale. And then the second is show an understanding to the word admiration. So listen carefully today for today's read aloud on examples of exaggeration in this tall tale about Paul Bunyan. And his job when he was in Maine was he was a logger. So someone who worked with cutting down trees. Even as a baby, Paul Bunyan was mighty big. How big? Well, he was so big that his parents had to use the cover wagon for his cradle. There's the wagon. Did Paul really sleep in a covered wagon as a baby? As you might imagine, young Paul Bunyan had a big appetite. He gobbled up 5 barrels of porridge a day, and his parents had to milk 4 dozen cows every morning and evening just to keep his baby bottle filled. Do you think he really ate 5 barrels of porridge a day, or that his parents had to milk 4 dozen cows for his baby bottle? Paul was so big, it caused some problems in the little town in Maine where he grew up. When he sneezed, he blew the birds from Maine to California. When he snored, the neighbors ran out of their house hollering, "Earthquake! Earthquake!" After that, Paul's father thought it might be better if Paul didn't sleep in town. He built a large cot on a large raft for Paul, and it floated it off the coast. Paul slept on the raft for a few nights, but the floating cot didn't work either. When Paul turned over in his sleep, he created gigantic waves that knocked down houses along the coast. You can see the waves getting knocked around. Eventually, Paul's father decided that the East Coast was just too small for Paul Bunyan. The only sensible thing to do was to move out west. So the Bunyan family moved to Minnesota. Okay, why were people moving out west again? In those days, Minnesota was full of logging camps, sawmills, and lumberjacks. lumberjacks. A lumberjack is someone who cuts down trees. The sawmill is where the trees are turned into boards. People use the wood from trees to build houses and to make many other things. Americans were moving west and building the country. They had to cut down a lot of trees to make their homes, not to mention their schools, churches, boats, and furniture. When he grew up, Paul Bunyan went to work as a lumberjack. And what a lumberjack he proved to be. He made himself a giant axe with a handle carved out of a full-grown hickory tree. He could bring down a giant tree with a single swing of his axe. So can a man really chop down a tree with one swing of an axe? What are these examples of so far? As the tree tipped over, he would yell, "Timber!" So the other lumberjacks had time to get out of the way. Everyone looked up to Paul Bunyan, way up. The other lumberjacks were full of admiration for him. Admiration means they thought very, very highly of him. The bosses were grateful for the amazing amount of work he could do in a single day. Paul had a big heart, too. But one thing he always wished for was a true friend. There simply wasn't anybody else his size who could be his friend. That all changed during the winter of the Big Blue Snow. It was called the winter of the Big Blue Snow because it was so cold that everyone shivered and turned blue. Even the snow shivered and turned blue. One day, as Paul made his way through the blue snowdrifts, he heard a muffled whimper. He followed the noise until he saw two big, blue, furry things sticking up out of the snow. He reached down and gave a pull. What do you think was in the snow? It turned out that the two big blue furry things were two big blue ears. And connected to the big blue ears was a giant blue baby ox. Paul exclaimed, "The poor little fellow is half frozen." Paul carried the blue ox home, wrapped him in blankets, and fed him. The baby ox was so content that he took a long nap in Paul's big, strong arms. When he woke up, he looked up at Paul, and do you know what he said? "Mama! Mama!" Then he gave Paul a big, slobbery lick on the face. Paul laughed and said, "Babe, we're going to be great friends." And they were. In fact, Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox were soon inseparable, meaning they could not be separated. Everywhere Paul went, Babe went too. The two of them worked together in the lumber camps. Paul chopped down the trees, then Babe hauled them to the river and dropped them in so they could float downstream to a sawmill. Remember that in order for settlers to farm new land, they sometimes had to prepare it for growing crops and building homes. They often did this by clearing trees away from their land. Together, Paul and Babe did the work of 100 men. The lumber company figured the best way to keep Paul Bunyan happy was through his stomach. So they hired a special cook to feed Paul and Babe. Why would the lumber company want to keep Paul Bunyan happy? The cook's name was Sourdough Sam. Sourdough Sam was known for the giant flapjacks he cooked in the world's biggest frying pan. Flapjacks are just another name for pancakes. The colossal pan sat on an enormous cast iron frame. Every morning, Sourdough Sam would build a raging forest fire underneath the pan. Then he would call for his two helpers, Lars Larson and Pete Peterson. Lars and Pete would grease up the pan by tying slabs of bacon to their feet and skating back and forth across the sizzling pan. Then Sourdough Sam would make a giant stack of pancakes for Paul and an even larger stack for Babe. Thanks to Sourdough Sam and his overgrown flapjacks, Babe eventually grew to be even bigger than Paul. He was so big that if you were standing at his front legs, you had to use a telescope to see all the way to his back legs. In fact, he was so heavy that his footprints filled up with water and turned into lakes. Babe making lakes with his footprints sounds like an example of what? In fact, there are more than 10,000 lakes in Minnesota today, and most of them were created by Babe the Blue Ox back in the frontier days. Babe and Paul helped the Lumberjacks solve all sorts of problems. Once there was a river that was full of twists and turns. Sometimes the trees would get stuck in the turns and never make it downstream to the sawmill. But Paul Bunyan thought of a way to fix that. He went to one end of the river and sent Babe to the other end. Paul grabbed the river and pulled in one direction, and Babe in the other direction, in the opposite direction. Then snap! Just like that, all of the kinks were pulled out and the river was straight as an axe handle. Of course, this tightening operation left the river a good deal longer than it had been before, and there was a lot of extra water lying around. Paul and Babe worked together to dig 5 big holes to hold all the extra water. And nowadays, these are called the Great Lakes. Again, did Paul Bunyan actually create the Great Lakes? This is definitely another example of exaggeration. One day, the logging bosses got to talking. One of them said that the United States was a fine country, to be sure, but it could still stand a little improvement. For one thing, it could use a few more rivers. And what it really needed was a big river running right down the middle of the country, all the way from Minnesota down to New Orleans. If we had a river like that, the man said, we could ship timber down to New Orleans and all around the world. Anyone know what river they're talking about? Paul Bunyan happened to overhear the conversation. He told the bosses he would see what he could do. He hitched up Babe and they started plowing south. As they plowed, they threw great mounds of dirt and rock to the right and a smaller mound to the left. On the right side, they made the Rocky Mountains, and on the left side, they made the Appalachian Mountains. Paul Bunyan and Babe didn't stop until they had plowed a channel all the way south to the Gulf of Mexico, and the river that flows in the channel nowadays, now that river is called the Mississippi River. From that day on, Paul and Babe went around the country using their size and strength to help anyone who needed it. Later, they dug the Grand Canyon as they made their way to the West Coast. And when the wind blows just right from the west, you can still smell those infamous colossal pancakes cooking on the frontier. Do you think you can still smell those pancakes, or is this an example of an exaggeration? What a fun story about Paul Bunyan and his larger-than-life characteristics. What things happen in this tall tale that can be called exaggerations? There's many examples. What are things in this story that probably could not happen in real life? Now, anyone know any of these things in this story that were real facts? If you could change one of the exaggerations in the story of Paul Bunyan, what would you change and why? I know for me, instead of colossal pancakes, I would have them make humongous colossal pizzas, because pizza is my absolute favorite. Okay, we're going to move into our word work word, and that word was admiration. Again, I'll read the word, you repeat it. Ready? Admiration. What two sounds is the vowel A making in this word? You can see the A right here and here. What two sounds is it making? Admiration. It's making an A and an A sound. It's making its long and short sound. What sound is the suffix tion? Now remember, prefix, like in the word displeases, is at the beginning. A suffix is what's at the end. So tion. Anyone know what that sound is? It's making a shun. Admiration. Anyone know what the word admiration means? So admiration's feeling of deep respect and liking or wonder for that person. So I have an admiration for my wife because she does so many things that are just super amazing, and I respect her so deeply for that. One person I have an admiration for is my mom because she is literally the best and is always wanting to help out. Do you have an admiration for anyone? So in our story, we talked about Paul Bunyan and his job. Anyone remember what his job was? Now, back in the day, they talked about Paul Bunyan talked about how they cut down the trees and they put them in the river. Now, why would they want to put trees in a river? Well, this quick little fun video, it's like a cartoon. Part of it's cartoon, but part of it is real recordings of loggers back in the day and putting things in rivers because it was easier for them to transport it. Take a watch and listen to this fun video of just loggers doing their job way back in the day.
If you ask any girl from the parish around what pleases her most from her head to her toes, she'll say, I'm not sure that it's business of yours, but I do like to waltz with the log driver, for he goes burning down and down like water. That's where the log driver learns to step lightly. It's burning down and down like water. The log driver's waltz pleases girls completely. When the drive's nearly over, I like to go down and watch all the lads as they work on the river. I know that come evening they'll be in the town, and we all like to waltz with the log driver, for he goes burning down and down like water. That's where the log driver learns to step lightly. It's burning down and down like water. The log driver's waltz pleases girls completely. To please both my parents, I've had to give way and dance with the doctors and merchants and lawyers. Their manners are fine, but their feet are a play, for there's none with the style of my log driver, for he goes burning down and down like water. That's where the log driver learns to step lightly. It's burning down and down like water. The log driver's waltz pleases girls completely. Now I've had my chances with all sorts of men, but none is so fine as my lad on the river. So when the drive's over, if he asks me again, I think I will marry my log driver, for he goes burning down and down like water. That's where the log driver learns to step lightly. It's burning
What a fun little video just to show you a little bit of exaggeration. You can see there's exaggeration once you went to the cartoon, but you can see at the beginning of that video on what log lumberjacks had to do to keep the trees from flowing down. Now we have trucks to carry trees and things to the sawmill. To end your time today, we're going to go through the tall tales chart. So what a chart is at the top of the chart is all the tall tales we're going to be reading. So we just read Paul Bunyan. So then we're going to go down and you're going to go through every single category and you're going to figure out what in the story, how it connects to Paul Bunyan. So where did Paul Bunyan have an amazing childhood or as a baby? What did he create or invent? What amazing adventures did he have? How was the story humorous or funny? And then at the bottom, you can't really see it that well. There we go. What were some exaggerations in the story? So you're going to go through that as our application. And I hope you enjoyed the first tall tale. We will move to our second tall tale tomorrow.